now we'll get to the crux of today's meeting. Let us welcome our panelists onto the stage.
You guys are good right there.
Oh,
They're fine, just turn around.
Okay, so let me kind of lay down the format and ground rules. We'll ask a question, and then the panelists up here can answer it. And you could be more of a conversational style, so don't worry about butting into someone else's sentence and catching them off guard or something. The purpose of the panel today is part of our project as human practice. So what we're trying to do is to promote iGEM throughout the school, community, and the world. And we're hoping to let the teachers have a meaningful discussion on the ethics and topics surrounding this issue so that we can raise more interest and to attack this problem in different ways rather than just science. So we have Mr. Franklin, Dr. Vidal-Bizarro, Dr. Costello, Mr. Fagan, and Dr. Bainton. Yeah, oh.
He said this week.
Yeah, you did. Just my name is shorter.
All right, now let us begin with our first question. If you could choose, would you want to live forever? Does someone want to volunteer to be first? Mr. Fagan.
Yes. Yes, I would like that's a very easy decision for me. I'm not sure what comes next, but I'm sure it's almost inevitable because I think something will kill me eventually. Maybe a truck, maybe a minor accident. So if I had the opportunity to live forever with pharmaceutical aid, I think I would take that and then let my next course of death be truck or cliff.
Dr. Costello?
I'm not totally sure if I'd want to live forever, but I'd want to know when I could sort of arrest my development. If it was 33, perhaps.
I'll take 19.
Oh, 19. 19.
I think I'm.
Yeah.
It's okay. Oh.
I would not want to live forever. There's part of me that finds it to be quite selfish, for me to occupy living space infinitely longer. I mean, what merit do I have to warrant that necessarily? I don't know if I just read that one book, you know what I'm talking about? The Bridge to Terabithia when I was really young. And it just really affected me where I was like, it is important for people to die. I came to terms with it at the age of 11 or something, I don't know.
I think there's a psychological desire for a lot of people to answer that question, yes. I think there's a lot of implications for everyone answering that question, yes. And to kind of pick up on Mr. Fagan's question, I think one thing that I've noticed as I'm looking at this presentation is there's probably a really interesting distinction between whether or not we would choose to live indefinitely or whether we would choose not to age. And I think the benefits of not aging but still dying naturally would probably be a little bit better than just living as we do and getting older and over. Again, thinking picture of Dorian Gray, there would be some kind of psychological latency or lunacy as well as just that aspect of decrepitness, which no one would really want to deal with if you just got older and older and older. But if you could stay young indefinitely, I think that would be pretty appealing to most.
I think I'd want favorable euthanasia laws to come along with this. So if I had the opportunity to live forever, I don't know what that really means yet because no one's lived forever. So maybe I also want the opportunity to check out optionally at some point.
And also, does it mean that everybody has that option to live forever? Because then what happens to genetic variation if all of us are just living forever? Are we also procreating as well?
Okay, thank you. We'll allow about 4 to 5 minutes for a question, so moving on to the next one.
I guess I know.
It's okay, it has to do with it too. Is death a necessary aspect of nature? Is it necessary for us to die?
Yes, but I'd like to try and avoid it.
I think there's also the point that we think that we live. The idea of living forever means that we're never actually going to die, but there's some constraints on the universe that makes it true that we're going to die regardless of what's actually going to happen. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, do I want to die from natural causes how everyone else dies, Or do I want to witness the heat death of the universe and watch my cells fall apart as everything up, and entropy just takes over everything? So how do you want to, the question is not whether you want to live forever, it's how you want to die, and do you want to see the end of the universe or not?
But one great thing, getting onto your topic, if we could live forever, maybe we could do some intergalactic travel and try to find another planet. I was at a talk a couple of weeks ago at Academia Sinica, and we really are at a catastrophic level right now in terms of our, climate change. So if you ever saw Cosmos with Carl Sagan when I was a kid, he was a professor at Cornell, and he had this great episode where there was a space machine if you could use hydrogen ions to actually harvest hydrogen ions in space, and then with nuclear fusion you could travel close to the speed of light, that we could possibly get to another planet or to an extrasolar system or even another galaxy. So maybe that's something that we need to think about. And if we could prolong life, maybe we could actually travel to another planet. If you want to take that.
Oh yeah. So I think that's an absolute necessary if we start elongating our lifespans. We're going to run out of space on the Earth. But I mean way more in the future, billions of years in the future, when the universe does actually die, more or less, for all intents and purposes, that it can't actually support. It can't even support an atom anymore because atoms have kind of fallen apart, sort of thing. But yeah, so I think I absolutely agree that intergalactic, well, at least inter-system travel has to exist in order to actually continue this.
Despite how amazing intergalactic tourism does sound, while I sit here, I think that there is something where there's kind of a fallacy of how much we can really control our lives. I think that depending on the culture and the society in which we live, our ability to cope with death varies greatly. And I do think it's necessary for us to die. I don't mean to be a fatalist, but I think that, inevitably, it's like the way that the universe has a trump card on us. As much as we might think that as the most developed species on the planet that we can manipulate our environment indefinitely, that the universe can still be like, Trump, you die. That at the end of the day, that's the balance, that's the check and the balance system, that we cannot be infinite necessarily. And I accept that. I'm not resistant to it. I think that it's the natural way, but.
My greatest concern is that if I continue to live, then that means that I continue to procreate successfully, which means that now I am covering the planet with more of me and like me. And so now I'm competing with me and like me's for more mates. And so I'm just making a whole big giant monoculture where you don't know who's wife, daughter, son, cousin. It just gets really messy. So I think if I live longer, it face increases genetic issues.
That short answer would be yes.
What would the social impacts of pharmaceutical immortality be?
I think for this question, and I'm recovering from laryngitis, which is somewhat ironic to the discussion because I'd like to have something replicating right now to keep that from keeping me from being young and healthy. But I think one of the ideas with the idea of extending life and maybe even extending our lives beyond the earth is we've got to think about what is this particular drug or this particular procedure trying to target. It's trying to basically stop the natural process that happens with aging, where the reproduction of cells happens and these things get shorter and shorter, and then things just stop working well. If we think about the fact that all of the things that causes that aren't necessarily just natural, but they also include our behaviors and the assumption of risks that we take beyond just the process of aging. I think if we eliminated the natural aspect of our bodies getting older and dying, we would have some really big problems to deal with in terms of the very negative behaviors that we have that actually bring on the sort of stresses and things that actually causes the DNA shortening or whatever. So I think we'd have a monster on our hands to contend with if we had no consequence to living beyond just the thing that sometimes worries us, which is at some point I'm going to die. But if we only had to deal with the unnatural aspects of death that we bring upon ourselves, I think eliminating just the natural process of dying would create a situation where those might become more pronounced in our behaviors, because we don't have that consequentialist thing holding us to living well or eating well or exercising or doing the right things. We'd probably be a lot less careless in those regards.
My big question for this is, so I live to a great age, but what is the quality of my life? So am I living it on life support, or am I hiking around the world and doing all kinds of great things?
But also, we have to think about the resources. We're already in trouble, so why do we want to have more people, hanging around? What about food, and other resources for all of these extra people that are just hanging around and not dying, not contributing to the overall carbon cycle?
I would be concerned about availability due to economics. Is this something that's only available to rich people? If you are poor and live forever, is that less favorable than being rich and living forever? So I would be concerned about the drug availability and what it meant for personal finances. Is it expensive to keep taking this medication? Do we end up just like biologically favoring the wealthy?
So to bring on to further extend Mr. Pagan's point, if I would assume that in fact this would be actually a fairly expensive thing, so you would end up getting a larger difference in classes in which you would have basically, rich immortals and then a bunch of poor young people, essentially, relatively young, with they're only less than 100 or something. Everyone else is like 200 or 300 years old. And then this also begs the question, what does pharmaceutical immortality mean? Because it's not like you don't break bones anymore, and those bones aren't going to necessarily heal as well. And so essentially, to some level, you're going to have a bunch of like half cyborgs at the age of like 200 or 300 years old who are super rich versus the lower class, which is like less than 100 years old. And you'll have a very, very strange social system. They're just completely ignoring the environmental impacts, of course, of everyone else that everyone else was bringing up as well.
In light of this information, I've changed my opinion. I'd like to die.
I'm actually very concerned that the first set of people have the most advantage financially because they have investment years, right? So they have that investment return, 2%, 5%, whatever it is. So the first people to become immortal will necessarily be wealthier than everyone else. Weird thought.
Right now, being wealthy means you live longer than being poor. I mean, that's true even without any other kind of manipulation of our genetics. The environments in which we live. And so I think that you think about the kinds of laws that will be passed by people who will have the kind of power and the kind of means, right, to be able to manipulate who can access these drugs. And even I think about like criminal activity, right? Like, what if they just say, at a certain point, if you have committed enough of these crimes, like why should you even be allowed to live any longer, right? And who is able to live long enough to be able to fund years and years of court proceedings to be able to continue, right, to procreate, or to like live upon the earth, while they just say, well, poor people, it's just X amount genetically, because like what do we even need them for anyway if they're committing these crimes? So I just think that like the progression, right, in this world is one that still will fall along the lines in which we currently live. I don't see it becoming a dramatically more democratic or more egalitarian or more fair, where the quality of life increases for everybody as a result of this research.
And something I just wanted to add on about telomeres also. Stress can also induce telomere ripping and shredding. Elizabeth Blackburn has done some really nice research on that, the woman who also co-founded telomerase. So people that are poor generally tend to be more stressed as well, so they're probably aging more quickly, at least biologically they are, and there is evidence for that.
All right, we'll take one last question for this. Response.
Well, I was going to say there would be a war between the cyborgs who had all the money and the vampires, or vampire-like people who were poor. So just think about that, Nosferatu.
Next question. What kind of other goals would you like to see iGEM or synthetic biology achieve?
or just to add on the broader scale, what role will genetic engineering play in the future, or rather, what role would you like to see it play in society?
I think for me, based on the talk that I went to a couple of weeks ago, and you were there, Rohan, I think we need to find another way to get energy. So I would think that would be where I would want to put my money.
I think this one's it. I think this is the big deal. I think curing death is a moral imperative. Even if it's a bad idea, I think it's the disease that affects the most people and should be thought of as the most important disease to cure above all others. So I think you guys have picked the prime disease, and I applaud you for thinking of it as a disease as opposed to a natural part of life.
I'd just like to weigh in. I'm glad you made that comment, because thinking of death as a disease is a definite opinion. It's definitely taking a certain perspective on thinking about that, and there is that debate about whether or not it should be put in the same category as things like cancer or Alzheimer's, as opposed to something natural. And I would only suggest, from another perspective, that death is not necessarily a negative thing. It doesn't necessarily have a moral value, if you choose to argue it from a different perspective. To paraphrase again from Nosferatu, there are things far worse than death. And if we do think of death as a bad thing, is more life necessarily a good thing?
But if we're given the ability to cure cancer and the ability to cure death, which one do we choose?
Well, you could cure death but still have rampant cancer. So
Absolutely.
Well, the
it's a
cancer is
toss-up.
exploiting the telomerase anyway, so most cancer cells have the
Good to
telomerase.
see.
85%.
Yeah. I agree. I don't think death is necessarily bad. But if we're curing any diseases to prevent death.
Yeah, and just to kind of, my way of thinking, I would like to think more in terms of the process of aging. I think that what I understand about that science and that research really deals with aging necessarily. I know there are certain types of species, worms and different things, that don't necessarily show the same sorts of aging that we do, pretty much up until right before they die. So really separating what's going on in that process with the effects of aging versus death itself, because as you said earlier, we could find the fountain of youth in this and still just be subject to maulings or other sorts of death by physical incidents or risks taken, et cetera, et cetera. So there is, still in my mind, I'd like to make that distinction and see how that would affect social behaviors as well.
I mean, Mr. Fagan, I wonder to what extent is curing to combat cancer is about preventing death. I think about the people that I've known, right, and I'm sure any of us can think of the people that we've known and loved who have struggled to, resist and to overcome, right, their cancer diagnoses. But I don't think that necessarily they were trying to prevent death, because there is nothing that can prevent death, right? It's this idea of the quality of your life for what you have for it. And I think that's always been the struggle about a very intensive invasive chemotherapy treatments, is that perhaps if I'm only predicted to live for so long, do I want to be sick at home, not being able to walk, to enjoy the air, to travel with my family, right, because of the chemotherapy? Or, so there's that kind of a discussion where I think that for medical practitioners as well, it's not so much about how do we prevent you from dying, it's more about, what is the quality of your life going to be, even with combating this cancer, as severely as we might try. And I think that's always been a choice for the patient to consider and for their families. So I also don't necessarily see death as it's kind of this monolithic entity of you fear and you cannot face it necessarily.
Yeah, I think dying's okay. I'm okay with it. Really, no, but if I could avoid it, I would, sure. Yeah, I think I'm comfortable with it. I know it's coming. But I think most of our medical practices are to improve quality of life and prolong life. So if we can prolong life longer, isn't it our moral obligation to do so? We don't say if somebody is a criminal, we still cure them of cancer. We don't make a moral judgment there. Are we allowed to make the moral judgment, well, I think it's a bad idea if we live forever, we shouldn't do this research? Are we allowed to make that decision?
Just to redirect, we had a great idea about the energy wanting, or iGEM and synthetic biology wanted to increase energy. You know, what are other ideas we have about goals that you'd like to see synthetic biology achieve?
I don't know what synthetic biology can achieve.
What are big
To some
issues
extent,
that you
isn't
see out there?
synthetic biology something like what goes on in Monsanto, where you take some corn grain and you make it so that it is resistant to pesticides or to insects or to any other natural diseases? So in some ways, Monsanto has already done this, with not just corn, but also with soy products and lots of other things.
Yes.
So synthetic biology, to some extent, is kind of like genetic modification.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then are we advocating for the immortality of genetically modified organisms?
Yes.
This is potentially where this argument could go.
I'm confused. Are we talking about other aspects of research for iGEM, or are we still hanging on to the telomerase?
Other goals
Oh,
that
other
you would
goals,
like
yeah.
to see.
Well, why can't we use it also to make pharmaceuticals? We use, recombinant DNA to make insulin, to make blood factors, to make all sorts of things. Can you continue with that? Or I think you had discussed even like cleaning up waste, right? Oil spills or
Food waste.
food waste. Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. Do you think synthetic biology is ethical?
Absolutely.
As my ethics students know, I never directly answer an ethics question.
Often grown in hospitals because they have so many cleanings and medications and whatever. So what you're doing is you're getting rid of a lot of bacteria, but some of the bacteria that manage to live begin to develop resistance to this. So you've made immortal bacteria that won't die to any of these normal things that we use to kill it.
But we don't have to use synthetic biology just to make antibiotics, right? I mean, I think that that's the only way we're going to have to go. If we have to feed everybody, we're going to be in trouble in like 100 years or even less. So unless we use recombinant DNA or iGEM resources, we're going to be in big trouble. Where are we going to get this food? And some of the other resources that we need.
I think all research can be used ethically and unethically. So the research itself isn't unethical. Applications of any research could be unethical.
I'm not exactly sure if this is within the scope, but is it possible, can we use synthetic biology to genetically create organs and that sort of thing? Or is that,
Yes.
so there's another situation, right? Can you grow brainless humans so that you can just use them for their body parts, right? If you're missing an arm or that sort of thing. And is that ethical or not? Is it ethical up until the point that you give them a brain and then therefore they have some form of sentience, hopefully? Or can you even grow something with sentience? Does it have sentience? And at that point, then you're getting into the huge ethic issues on whether or not you're actually messing with something which actually has self-awareness or something close to self-awareness. And we also don't know exactly where self-awareness starts. So that's another issue. It's probably not in a liver or a kidney, and it's probably have to do something with the brain, but essentially, if you want to grow a nervous system for someone who doesn't have, a properly functioning central nervous system, and, is that ethical? Are you essentially stealing another person's body and using that?
Does it make it more ethical if you're using animals for this?
Depends on how much you like animals.
We'll move on to the next question. Next. Okay, now we'd like to open up to the audience to ask a few questions. So, would anyone want to ask any?
I have a statement, not really a question. I know it's really troubling, the whole telomeres cure for death thing, but a great deal of the research into telomere shortening is actually to cure Werner syndrome and progeria. So I would say, forge ahead with your research because it's actually for real diseases that are killing real people, not just fixing rich people's death issue. That's all I wanted to say.
And just to add on to what Sarah's saying too, even the telomerase, there is in the literature that says it's a double-edged sword. It's not, there's a lot of complexity involved in that. So, I think it's going to be a long way before we can
because if the cell starts reproducing infinitely, that's a little bit of a problem.
Yeah, and there are other things about recombination and some other fusion
Who
and
knows what stops
telomeres,
working
fusion with
after 80,
telomeres
right?
and all sorts of stuff.
We talked about having it go too long and then having a kill switch. If it extends too long, then we have to like chop it off at some certain point. So there is a problem there.
Anyone else have a question?
I'd just like to make a little statement. If we manage to achieve immortality, wouldn't that destroy people's human life values and civil liberties? Because imagine this. Imagine a limited Earth with an unlimited amount of people. There has to be some way of controlling that people or else they would all die. Because they use up all the resources, and thus what I'm thinking is maybe in the future, if this does happen, there be some form of authoritarian government, dystopian world, where eugenics is practiced universally, and there might be a kill switch for everybody. So if you reach a certain age, you die. Which is often featured in cyberpunk literature.
Science fiction sometimes is a particular future thing, so you never know.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
So if consumer researchers were to come across a question, a debate about whether or not they should continue their research regarding synthetic biology, how exactly would they conduct the discussion of whether or not they should continue with this research? Like, should they open it up to the public, or should they limit this discussion to close group, or how exactly should they do this?
I'm sure the guys who drafted the hydrogen bomb did not have in mind how it was going to be used. So it really goes back to what I think it was Matt said about how the actual research itself could be very ethical, and hopefully you're carrying it out ethically, but how it's practiced or carried out, used or applied, that you have very little control over.
But there are committees. But there are ethics.
Ethics committees and panels now, and everything is published. So
Yeah.
it's not like it's kept.
For those of you who answered straight up, yes, I would like to die, if you realize you have like, you would die in the next week, would you like to extend your life or something like that?
I answered yes. Short answer, no. Long answer. I think, again, I think one of the big aspects of this for me is, I think one of the actual benefits of the application of this, of course, is the improving of health and quality of life. In terms of things to be the way they are because the universe wants them to be that way, or because that's the way they are to be. And so, you know, science in many great ways opens up the possibilities for us. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every door that's open should be walked through. Okay, we can look at that threshold and think about the possibilities, but it doesn't mean because we can, we should all the time.
Okay, last one.
I just wanted to say a little bit about why I do want to live forever. I'm pretty comfortable dying. I think that's okay. I think it's natural. I'm ready for it. I know it's going to come randomly at any moment. Why I would like to live forever is I think this is really cool. I don't know what else happens. I'm totally amazed. I know it's going to get stranger and stranger, and I want to see as much of it as I can. I know technology and synthetic biology are going to go through the roof. Our lives and the world around us is going to get incredibly bizarre, and I just want to see as much of it as I can. So I'm in for as long as we can go.
Okay, thank you. Can we have a round of applause for the I'd personally like to say that I really enjoyed this conversation, and in fact, I don't know why we don't have more of these. On different topics, I mean, not only related to, I think it's nice for people to come in and get a diverse perspective on ideas. But yeah, maybe we can continue it. One thing is, I just want to, something about death popped into my mind. I know some of you have to go, so if that's the case, then you should, but it's actually by a poet that Mr. Franklin's very familiar with called Rainer Maria Rilke, and what he said about death was that the human mind is very limited to the world. you can only go so far with our senses, so there's a limited understanding we can reach to everything that's around us. And